Imagine waking up tomorrow morning, reaching for your smartphone on the nightstand, with that familiar muscle memory we've all developed over the last decade and a half, and discovering through some impossible revelation delivered by a breathless news anchor whose own disbelief is palpable even through the screen, that the device you've been holding, the technological marvel you've been casually scrolling through while waiting for your coffee to brew, was actually manufactured in 1823 in a workshop in Victorian London, where gaslight still flickered against soot-stained walls, where the Industrial Revolution was barely wheezing into existence, where the very concept of electricity remained a parlor trick, performed by natural philosophers with brass instruments and Leyden jars, and where the notion of a microprocessor, of silicon chips etched with circuitry measured in nanometers, of satellites orbiting overhead transmitting signals at the speed of light, would have been dismissed as the fever dreams of a madman who had spent too much time inhaling mercury vapors in some poorly ventilated laboratory. The sheer impossibility of it would fundamentally break your understanding of history, of technological progression, of the linear narrative we tell ourselves about how humanity stumbles forward through time, building upon the knowledge of previous generations in a steady, comprehensible accumulation of discovery and innovation. This vertiginous sensation of historical impossibility, this feeling that the ground beneath your feet has suddenly revealed itself to be far less solid than you believed, is precisely what archaeologists experienced in 1994 when they finally understood what Göbekli Tepe actually was. When the carbon dating results came back again and again with the same impossible answer. When every attempt to rationalize the findings into something more palatable, more compatible with the established timeline of human civilization, collapsed under the weight of the physical evidence arrayed before them in the harsh Anatolian sunlight. Klaus Schmidt, the German archaeologist who would dedicate the rest of his life to excavating this enigmatic site on a barren hillside in southeastern Turkey, had initially arrived with relatively modest expectations, drawn by local shepherds' stories about strange stones jutting from the earth. Stories that previous surveyors had dismissed as nothing more than the remnants of a Byzantine cemetery, unremarkable and unworthy of serious archaeological attention. But Schmidt possessed that rare combination of scholarly rigor and imaginative audacity that allows certain individuals to see what others miss. And as he walked across that windswept plateau, feeling the ancient stones beneath his boots, examining the weathered limestone that broke through the soil like the bones of some impossibly ancient creature, he began to suspect that the conventional interpretation was not merely wrong, but catastrophically, fundamentally, almost offensively wrong. The moment of realization, when the radiocarbon analysis revealed that these structures were not 2,000 years old, not even 5,000 years old, but rather dated to approximately 9600 BCE, pushing back the origins of monumental architecture by thousands of years, and fundamentally demolishing every assumption about when and how and why human beings first organized themselves to build permanent structures that served purposes beyond immediate survival, must have felt like watching the entire edifice of archaeological orthodoxy crumble into dust, leaving Schmidt standing alone in a landscape suddenly rendered alien and unfamiliar, despite humanity's supposed mastery over our own historical narrative. This was a temple complex, massive and sophisticated and architecturally ambitious, built when human beings were supposedly living in small, nomadic bands, following migrating herds of animals across grasslands and tundra, sheltering in caves and temporary encampments, subsisting on whatever they could hunt or gather, possessing no written language, no pottery, no domesticated animals, no agricultural practices, no permanent settlements, No social hierarchy complex enough to organize large-scale construction projects, no surplus food production to feed workers who weren't actively engaged in the daily struggle for survival, and yet here it stood. Undeniable and impossible, carved from living bedrock and arranged with mathematical precision that suggested knowledge of geometry and astronomy that shouldn't have existed for thousands of years to come. The engineering alone represents a profound impossibility that modern minds struggle to fully comprehend, because we have become so accustomed to the idea that technological capability follows a predictable trajectory, that ancient peoples were proportionally less capable than we are, that the tools available to any given civilization directly determine what that civilization can achieve. And yet Göbekli Tepe casually demolishes these comfortable assumptions with the simple fact of its existence. The pillars that form the central architectural elements of the temple complex are massive T-shaped monoliths carved from limestone, some of them standing over 18 feet tall and weighing upwards of 20 tons, which means that somehow, using tools made of stone and bone and wood, without the benefit of metal implements, without wheels to transport these massive weights, without draft animals to pull sledges or carts, without cranes or pulleys or any of the mechanical advantages we associate with large-scale construction, the builders of Göbekli Tepe managed to quarry these enormous stones from the bedrock, shape them with precision and artistry, transport them across the irregular terrain, and then raise them into standing position, arranging them in circular enclosures with an attention to astronomical alignments and geometric relationships that speaks to sophisticated planning and mathematical understanding. The artistry carved into these pillars represents another layer of impossibility, because these are not crude attempts at decoration, not the simple scratches and grooves you might expect from people working with primitive tools, but rather detailed, naturalistic representations of animals rendered with an artistic sophistication that wouldn't be out of place in much later civilizations. Scorpions and snakes and foxes and vultures and lions and bulls, all depicted with attention to anatomical accuracy and compositional balance, their forms flowing across the stone surface with a confidence and skill that suggests not amateur experimentation, but rather the work of accomplished artists working within an established tradition, which raises the disturbing question of where that tradition came from. Because traditions don't simply appear fully formed, they evolve through generations of practice and refinement and cultural transmission. Modern attempts to replicate even a fraction of this carving work using period-appropriate tools have revealed just how labor-intensive and technically demanding the process must have been. How many thousands of hours would have been required to produce the intricate reliefs that cover these pillars? How much obsidian and flint would have been consumed in the endless process of pecking and grinding and polishing the hard limestone? And yet the evidence suggests that Göbekli Tepe wasn't the work of a few generations slowly accumulating architectural knowledge through trial and error, but rather appears to have been conceived and executed with remarkable coherence and consistency, as if the blueprint already existed in someone's mind before the first stone was ever quarried. The organizational challenge might be the most impossible aspect of all, because coordinating hundreds of workers across the decades or centuries required to complete this complex would have demanded social structures and administrative capabilities that weren't supposed to exist in hunter-gatherer societies, which by definition lack the hierarchical organization, the specialized labor, the surplus food production, and the mechanisms of social control necessary to compel or convince large numbers of people to dedicate their lives to a construction project that offered no immediate practical benefit to their survival. Modern hunter-gatherer groups typically number between 20 and 50 individuals, operating as egalitarian bands without formal leadership structures or the ability to mobilize large-scale collective labor. Yet Göbekli Tepe required something fundamentally different, some social innovation or organizational genius that allowed these supposedly primitive people to accomplish what settled agricultural civilizations with written records and established hierarchies wouldn't achieve for thousands of years to come. And the orthodox explanation that religious fervor alone motivated this extraordinary effort, that belief in the sacred was sufficient to overcome all these practical obstacles, feels unsatisfyingly vague, like an intellectual placeholder masking our genuine ignorance about what actually transpired on this Anatolian hillside 12,000 years ago. The timeline itself represents perhaps the most vertiginous impossibility, because Göbekli Tepe predates Stonehenge by approximately 6,000 years, predates the Egyptian pyramids by roughly 7,000 years, predates the invention of pottery and the domestication of plants and animals and the development of settled agricultural communities, which means that everything we thought we understood about the progression of human civilization, about the necessary prerequisites for monumental architecture, about the relationship between technological capability and social organization, needs to be fundamentally reconsidered in light of this single site that refuses to conform to the established narrative. When these pillars were being carved and raised into position, the last ice age had only recently ended. Woolly mammoths still roamed the northern reaches of the continents. Saber-toothed cats prowled through forests that would eventually give way to modern ecosystems. And human beings were supposedly living the same lifestyle our species had maintained for nearly 200,000 years. And yet somehow, in this one location, something different happened. Some spark of ambition or necessity or vision drove people to attempt something that shouldn't have been attempted for millennia. And they succeeded so spectacularly that their achievement still stuns us across the immense gulf of time that separates our world from theirs. Mainstream archaeology, confronted with this impossible structure that fundamentally contradicts the established timeline of human development, has responded by suggesting that perhaps our assumptions about hunter-gatherers were simply too narrow, that these people were more sophisticated than we gave them credit for, that the neat progression from nomadic hunting to settled agriculture to complex civilization to monumental architecture was never as linear or inevitable as we imagined. And while this explanation has the virtue of not requiring any radical departures from scientific orthodoxy, it also raises uncomfortable questions that remain frustratingly unanswered despite decades of excavation and analysis. How did they know to do this, to undertake a construction project of such ambition and scale without any apparent precedent, without any earlier attempts to learn from, without any architectural tradition to build upon? Why did they do this, investing such enormous resources into a structure that offered no obvious practical benefit, no shelter from the elements, no defense against enemies, no storage for food, serving only purposes we can guess at, but never truly understand? And most troublingly, most mysteriously, most impossible to reconcile with any conventional explanation, why, after investing all this labor and skill and vision into creating what must have been the most magnificent structure their world had ever seen, did they deliberately bury it, carefully filling in the entire complex with thousands upon thousands of tons of dirt and rubble, entombing their masterpiece as if they wanted to preserve it for some unimaginable future or hide it from some threat we can't even comprehend? This final detail, this deliberate burial that has preserved Göbekli Tepe far better than abandonment ever could have, represents a mystery within the mystery, because people don't generally bury their most sacred spaces unless they have compelling reasons to do so, and the care with which this burial was executed, the way the fill was placed to avoid damaging the pillars, the deliberation evident in the entire process, suggests not destruction, but preservation, not disgrace, but reverence, not an ending, but perhaps a pause, a safeguarding of something precious against some anticipated catastrophe or transformation that the builders knew was coming. When you stand among those ancient pillars today, under the modern protective structures that now shield them from the elements, you're looking at something that was deliberately hidden for nearly 12,000 years. Something that was meant to survive into an age when the people who built it and their children and their children's children had long since turned to dust. And the question that should haunt anyone who contemplates this profound mystery is simple and terrifying. What did they know that we've forgotten? And what were they trying to tell whoever eventually found this place? This impossible temple that breaks every rule we thought we understood about who built the ancient world and why. The answer to that question, the identity of these builders who accomplished the impossible and then deliberately erased themselves from history, might be far stranger and more unsettling than orthodox archaeology is willing to admit. And understanding who they really were requires us to examine not just what they built, but when they built it, in an age that should have been far too primitive to produce anything remotely like Göbekli Tepe, which is precisely where our investigation must turn next. To truly comprehend the staggering impossibility of Göbekli Tepe, to feel in your bones the sheer wrongness of its existence in the timeline of human history, you need to understand with visceral clarity what the world actually looked like in 9600 BCE, what human life consisted of during that distant epoch when the last ice age had only recently released its grip on the northern continents, and our species was supposedly living in a manner barely distinguishable from the lifestyle our ancestors had maintained for tens of thousands of years, following the same patterns of movement and survival and adaptation that had carried humanity through countless generations without any apparent need or desire for the kind of monumental permanence that Göbekli Tepe represents. The textbook timeline that we've all absorbed through years of education, the clean narrative arc that carries humanity from primitive hunter-gatherers scraping out a marginal existence in a hostile world, through the agricultural revolution that allowed for settled communities and surplus food production, then onward to the specialization of labor and the development of crafts and trades, eventually culminating in the rise of complex civilizations with their hierarchical social structures and monumental architecture, and written languages capable of transmitting knowledge across generations. This entire progression makes intuitive sense, follows a logical sequence of cause and effect, represents exactly the kind of story that human minds excel at constructing and remembering, which is perhaps why the existence of Göbekli Tepe feels so profoundly threatening to our understanding of our own past, because it inverts this entire sequence, placing the monument before the civilization, the temple before the agriculture, the architectural sophistication before any of the supposed prerequisites that should have made such sophistication possible. According to every archaeological model developed over the past century, every theoretical framework constructed to explain how human societies evolve from simple to complex, the progression should be inevitable and unidirectional. First, you need agriculture to produce food surpluses that free some portion of the population from the constant demands of hunting and gathering. Then you need settled communities where these agricultural populations can live in close proximity and develop the social bonds and organizational structures that allow for collective action, then you need specialization where individuals can dedicate themselves to particular crafts or skills rather than maintaining the broad competence required for survival in a hunter-gatherer context. And only after all these pieces are in place, only after you have a stable agricultural base and permanent settlements and specialized crafts, people, and some form of social hierarchy to coordinate large-scale projects, can you even begin to contemplate building monuments, creating structures that serve symbolic or religious or astronomical purposes rather than immediate practical needs? This sequence has been taught in every anthropology classroom, repeated in countless textbooks, reinforced by archaeological evidence from sites around the world where you can trace the gradual emergence of complexity through stratigraphic layers that preserve the material record of human cultural evolution. And yet Göbekli Tepe simply ignores this entire framework, presenting us with the monuments first, the sophisticated architecture first, the organized labor and artistic, tradition first with agriculture and settled communities, and all the supposed prerequisites emerging only afterwards, as if the conventional timeline had been deliberately scrambled by some cosmic trickster determined to undermine our confidence in our ability to understand our own history. The world of 9600 BCE was a place that would be almost unrecognizable to modern eyes, a landscape still bearing the scars and transformations of the Pleistocene epoch that had dominated Earth's climate for millions of years. And to place yourself imaginatively in that time requires stripping away not just modern technology and infrastructure, but also the entire agricultural and pastoral landscape that has defined human existence for the past 10 millennia. Returning to an Earth where humans occupied only the smallest fraction of the land surface, living in scattered bands that left barely a trace of their passage through the world. The great ice sheets that had covered much of North America and Europe were rapidly retreating, their meltwater pouring into the oceans and raising sea levels by hundreds of feet, drowning coastal plains that had been inhabited by human populations for thousands of years, and redrawing the map of the world in ways that would have seemed apocalyptic to anyone living through these changes. Though of course they had no maps to redraw, no written records to preserve the memory of lands swallowed by the rising waters, no institutional knowledge beyond what could be transmitted orally through songs and stories that would themselves be transformed and forgotten across the generations. The fauna of this world included creatures that seem almost mythological to us now. Woolly mammoths still grazed across the northern grasslands of Eurasia and America, though their populations were already in decline as the warming climate and human hunting pressure pushed them toward the extinction they would reach within a few thousand years. While in North America, giants, ground sloths weighing several tons browsed on vegetation in forests and grasslands. Saber-toothed cats prowled in search of the megafauna that had been their prey for millions of years, and massive short-faced bears, standing over 12 feet tall when reared up on their hind legs, dominated the landscape as apex predators more formidable than any carnivore alive today. Human beings in this world lived as they had lived for approximately 200,000 years since our species first emerged in Africa, organized into small mobile groups that anthropologists typically estimate at 20 to 50 individuals, though occasionally these bands might gather together for seasonal ceremonies or to exploit particularly abundant resources like salmon runs or caribou migrations, creating temporary aggregations of perhaps a few hundred people before dispersing again into the smaller units that represented the fundamental social organization of our species throughout most of our existence on this planet. These groups possessed no permanent structures beyond temporary shelters constructed from whatever materials were locally available. Branches and hides and stones arranged to provide minimal protection against wind and rain and cold. Structures that could be abandoned without regret when the group moved on to follow game or to exploit different seasonal food sources, because permanence was antithetical to the hunter-gatherer lifestyle. A liability rather than an asset when survival depended on mobility and the ability to respond flexibly to changing environmental conditions. They had no pottery, because ceramic vessels are heavy and fragile and therefore incompatible with a nomadic existence where everything you own must be carried with you. No domesticated animals except perhaps dogs who had already begun their ancient partnership with humanity. No cultivated plants or agricultural practices. No metal tools of any kind, working instead with stone and bone and wood and fiber. Materials that required immense skill to work effectively, but that imposed strict limitations on what could be accomplished, particularly when it came to shaping hard stone or moving heavy weights or creating permanent structures capable of surviving for generations. The absence of writing meant that knowledge existed only in human memory, transmitted through demonstration and storytelling, and the kind of embodied practice that allows skills to pass from generation to generation without ever being codified in external records, which created both remarkable continuity and profound fragility. Continuity because skills practiced daily and transmitted through direct apprenticeship from parent to child or from expert to novice could remain remarkably stable across enormous spans of time. But fragility because any disruption to this transmission, any catastrophe that killed off the practitioners of a particular skill or forced a population to abandon a particular practice, meant that knowledge could simply vanish, leaving no trace beyond perhaps a few enigmatic artifacts whose purpose and creation method would be lost to all subsequent generations. These people had no cities, no towns, no permanent settlements of any kind, no writing systems, no currency, no formal hierarchies beyond the informal status that came from skill or experience, or the respect earned through a lifetime of contributing to the group's survival. And according to everything we think we understand about human social organization, they should have had no capacity whatsoever to conceive of, plan and execute a construction project like Göbekli Tepe, which required not just technical skill, but organizational genius. Not just individual effort, but coordinated labor involving hundreds of people working together across what must have been decades, if not centuries, to complete the massive complex that now emerges from the Anatolian soil. Like a message from a past we thought we understood, or clearly never did, the labor requirements alone represent a mathematical impossibility that becomes more striking the more carefully you examine it. Because modern estimates suggest that quarrying and moving and erecting just one of those massive T-shaped pillars would have required several hundred people working together in coordinated fashion, pulling or rolling or levering the multi-ton stone across irregular terrain without the benefit of wheels or pulleys or draft animals, using only human muscle power and whatever mechanical advantages they could improvise from ropes and levers and perhaps rollers cut from logs. And when you multiply this effort across the dozens of pillars that form the complex, when you add in the thousands of hours required for the intricate carving work that adorns these stones, when you factor in all the supporting labor needed to feed and shelter and coordinate this workforce, you arrive at a total investment of human effort that should have been completely impossible for a hunter-gatherer society to sustain. Hunter-gatherers don't have surplus food because storing food requires pottery or other containers that nomadic peoples don't possess, And because the hunter-gatherer lifestyle is fundamentally immediate, focused on meeting today's needs through today's efforts, rather than accumulating resources for future use, which means that every person in a hunter-gatherer band needs to be actively engaged in food procurement for a significant portion of their time, leaving little opportunity for specialized labor or long-term projects that don't directly contribute to survival. And yet somehow the builders of Göbekli Tepe managed to support hundreds of people who were engaged not in hunting or gathering, but in the monumentally unproductive task of moving and carving stones, which implies either that these people had discovered some way to generate food surpluses that left no archaeological trace, or that they were mobilizing labor from across a much wider region than we typically associate with hunter-gatherer territories, drawing people from dozens or hundreds of separate bands to participate in this collective project for reasons we can barely imagine. The knowledge problem cuts even deeper than the labor problem, because building techniques and artistic traditions don't simply appear fully formed in the archaeological record, they evolve through generations of experimentation and refinement, through trial and error and the gradual accumulation of practical wisdom about what works and what doesn't, about how to quarry stone without shattering it, how to move massive weights without killing your workers, how to carve hard limestone with stone tools without spending years on each relief. And yet when we examine Göbekli Tepe's earliest layers, when we look at the oldest structures that have been excavated from this site, we find not primitive experiments or crude first attempts, but rather fully realized architecture demonstrating sophisticated knowledge of engineering principles and artistic conventions that seem to have no precedent, no learning curve, no developmental sequence. The pillars in the oldest enclosures are actually more impressive than those in the later structures, more massive and more finely carved and more carefully arranged, which is exactly the opposite of what we should expect if this were a normal case of a society learning how to build monuments through practice and experience. And this inversion of the expected pattern raises the deeply troubling possibility that the knowledge demonstrated at Göbekli Tepe didn't emerge locally through gradual development, but rather came from somewhere else, was imported or inherited or remembered from some other context that has left no trace in the archaeological record beyond this single enigmatic site that refuses to conform to any model we've constructed to explain how human civilization develops. The motivation problem might be the most philosophically challenging aspect of this entire mystery, because even if we could somehow explain how hunter-gatherers managed to mobilize the labor and possess the technical knowledge to build Göbekli Tepe, we still need to explain why they would choose to do so. What could possibly motivate people living at subsistence level to invest such enormous resources into a structure that offered no obvious practical benefit? No shelter from the elements, no defense against enemies, no storage for food or water, serving only purposes that we categorize as religious or ceremonial or symbolic, because we have no better explanation for architecture that seems designed to serve the spirit rather than the body. The standard archaeological explanation invokes religious devotion as a universal human impulse, powerful enough to motivate extraordinary efforts, pointing to countless examples from later civilizations where people invested enormous resources in temples and shrines and sacred structures. But this explanation glosses over a crucial distinction. In every other case we can examine, monumental religious architecture emerges only after a society has developed the agricultural surplus and social organization and institutional structures that make such projects feasible, appearing as a product of civilization rather than a catalyst for it. And yet, Göbekli Tepe inverts this relationship too, presenting us with the temple before the civilization, the monument before the settlement, as if religious architecture could somehow conjure into existence the very social structures and economic foundations that should have been its prerequisites. Unless, of course, the entire framework we've been using to understand Göbekli Tepe is fundamentally flawed, based on the assumption that the people who built it were primitive hunter-gatherers gradually evolving toward agricultural civilization, when the evidence might actually be telling us something far stranger and more unsettling, that these builders weren't primitive at all, that they possessed knowledge and organizational capacity that came from somewhere else, from some earlier chapter of human history that we've lost or forgotten or never knew existed, and that what we're looking at in Göbekli Tepe isn't the beginning of civilization, but rather the ending of something much older, a final monument constructed by people who knew that their world was ending and wanted to preserve something, anything, for whoever came after, which would explain the deliberate burial, the careful preservation, the sense of intentionality that pervades this entire site, and that points toward a truth we've been reluctant to consider, that human history might be far longer and stranger and more catastrophic than the comfortable narrative we've constructed, and that Göbekli Tepe might be the key to understanding what came before everything we thought we knew. The hypothesis that archaeologists whisper about in private conversations but rarely commit to print. The theory that gets dismissed in academic journals as speculative fantasy while nonetheless nagging at the consciousness of anyone who has stood among those ancient pillars and felt the weight of their impossibility pressing down like the burden of a truth too uncomfortable to acknowledge, suggests that perhaps we've been asking the wrong question all along. Not how did primitive hunter-gatherers build Göbekli Tepe, but rather, why do we assume the builders were primitive in the first place? And what if the people who carved those massive stones and arranged them with astronomical precision and then deliberately buried them, for reasons we still can't fathom, were not the beginning of something, but the end of something? Not the first stirrings of civilization emerging from the darkness of prehistory, but rather the last gasp of a civilization that was already ancient when these monuments were constructed, already fading into the kind of catastrophic collapse that erases cultures so thoroughly that later generations have no memory they ever existed at all. This is not a theory about ancient aliens or divine intervention, or any of the sensationalist explanations that popular media loves to invoke whenever confronted with archaeological mysteries that resist conventional interpretation, but rather a hypothesis about humans, about our own species, and what we might have achieved and lost during the hundreds of thousands of years that preceded the relatively brief period of recorded history that we mistakenly treat as representing the totality of human cultural evolution, about the possibility that the story we tell ourselves about our steady progress from primitive to sophisticated, from ignorant to enlightened, from powerless to dominant, might be not just incomplete, but fundamentally wrong in ways that the existence of Göbekli Tepe forces us to confront. The geological and climatological context of the late Pleistocene and early Holocene provides a framework for understanding how entire civilizations could have been erased from the archaeological record with a thoroughness that makes their very existence seem impossible to prove or even to seriously investigate, because the period around 10,000 BCE, the era when Göbekli Tepe was constructed, represents one of the most catastrophic transitions in Earth's recent climate history, a time when the planet was convulsing with changes so dramatic and so rapid that human populations living through them must have experienced what felt like the ending of the world itself. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, which remains controversial but gains more supporting evidence with each passing year as researchers identify impact markers and melt signatures in geological strata. From this period suggests that a comet or asteroid or swarm of cosmic debris struck the northern ice sheets approximately 100 years ago, triggering a cascade of environmental catastrophes that included massive wildfires across multiple continents, the sudden and catastrophic collapse of ice dams that had held back enormous glacial lakes, the release of unimaginable quantities of fresh water into the North Atlantic that disrupted ocean currents and plunged the world back into glacial conditions for more than a millennium, and the extinction of dozens of megafauna species that had survived previous climate fluctuations but could not withstand this particular combination of environmental stresses and human hunting pressure. The sea level changes that accompanied the end of the last ice age represent an even more relentless erasure of human history, because as the great ice sheets melted and poured their contents into the oceans over the course of several thousand years, sea levels rose by approximately 400 feet, gradually but inexorably drowning the coastal plains where human populations have always preferentially settled, where resources are most abundant and climate is most moderate, and travel by water makes communication and trade far easier than the difficult overland journeys through forests and mountains and deserts that separate inland regions. These drowned coastlines, now lying beneath hundreds of feet of seawater on continental shelves that extend for dozens or even hundreds of miles beyond the current shorelines, represent a vast blind spot in our understanding of human prehistory. Because we have explored less than 20% of the ocean floor, even with modern technology. And the portions we have explored have generally been in the deep ocean, rather than the shallow continental shelves where ancient settlements would have been located. Which means that we're essentially trying to reconstruct human history while ignoring the regions where most humans probably lived. The productive coastal zones that offered access to both marine and terrestrial resources, and that would have been the obvious locations for any sophisticated pre-Ice Age civilizations to develop. Recent discoveries of submerged structures and settlements, found almost accidentally by divers or fishermen or researchers looking for something else entirely, hint at how much we're missing beneath the waves. Doggerland, the vast plain that once connected Britain to continental Europe, and that supported substantial human populations before being gradually submerged by rising seas, has been mapped in recent years using data from oil companies conducting seismic surveys, revealing a landscape of rivers and hills, and what appear to be human settlements now lying beneath the North Sea. The structures off the coast of India near the Gulf of Campat, discovered during routine surveys and dated to approximately 900 to 500 years ago, suggest the existence of urban settlements far older than the Indus Valley civilization that has traditionally been considered the earliest in the region. The Yonaguni Monument off the coast of Japan, whether natural or artificial, remains hotly disputed, but which displays features that at minimum suggest significant human modification of natural rock formations, lies at depths that indicate it was last above water during the late Pleistocene, implying human activity in that region at a time when conventional archaeology suggests only scattered hunter-gatherer populations existed in Japan. The notion that Göbekli Tepe might represent not the beginning of monumental architecture, but rather a monument to an ending, a memorial constructed by survivors of a much older and more sophisticated civilization that had been largely destroyed by the cataclysms of the Younger Dryas period, reframes every mysterious aspect of the site in ways that suddenly make a terrible kind of sense. Because if the builders were not primitive hunter-gatherers, slowly discovering the principles of architecture and organization, but rather the remnants of a population that had once possessed these skills and was now desperately trying to preserve what knowledge remained. Then the sophisticated engineering and artistic traditions evidenced at Göbekli Tepe need not have been developed locally through generations of trial and error, but could instead represent the application of knowledge brought from elsewhere, from coastal settlements now drowned beneath the rising seas, or from population centers destroyed by the fires and floods and climate chaos that accompanied the end of the Ice Age. The astronomical alignments built into the structures, the precise geometry of the enclosures, the sophisticated understanding of mathematics and engineering required to conceive and execute such a complex, all become far less mysterious if we imagine these builders as people who had inherited this knowledge from previous generations, who had lived in more favorable circumstances, who had the leisure and resources to develop sophisticated cultural traditions over long periods of stability, and who passed this knowledge to their children and grandchildren even as their world collapsed around them, and they were forced to return to more basic subsistence strategies just to survive. The deliberate burial of Göbekli Tepe, that most enigmatic aspect of the entire site that has never been satisfactorily explained by conventional archaeology, transforms from inexplicable mystery into tragic necessity if we understand it as an act of preservation by people who knew their civilization was ending, who recognized that the knowledge required to build and maintain such structures was being lost as populations scattered and died and forgot the old ways in the desperate struggle to survive in a world gone mad with climate change and resource scarcity and social collapse. Burial would have been the most effective preservation strategy available to people without metal tools or advanced construction materials, because while the pillars themselves were made of stone and therefore durable, leaving them exposed to the elements would mean millennia of weathering and erosion, the gradual wearing away of the carved details, the eventual collapse of the standing stones as their bases were undermined by frost and rain, whereas carefully filling in the entire complex with dirt and rubble would create a protective cocoon that would preserve the structures almost perfectly, maintaining them in a kind of suspended animation until some future generation might rediscover them and perhaps understand their significance, perhaps learn from them the lesson that civilizations can be lost completely, that knowledge can be forgotten so thoroughly that later peoples have no idea their ancestors once possessed it, that human history is not a steady upward march, but rather a chaotic landscape of rises and falls and catastrophic collapses that erase entire worlds. The parallels with other megalithic sites that appear across the globe during roughly the same time period, all manifesting similar characteristics of sophisticated engineering and astronomical knowledge, despite being separated by thousands of miles and supposedly having no contact with one another, suggest the possibility of a common source, a shared heritage that connects these disparate monuments in ways that mainstream archaeology has been reluctant to acknowledge, because doing so would require abandoning the comfortable model of independent development in favor of something more complex and more difficult to prove. Karahan Tepe, discovered recently just 30 miles from Göbekli Tepe, displays many of the same architectural features and appears to date from the same general period, though excavations are still in early stages and it's too soon to draw definitive conclusions about the relationship between the two sites. But the proximity and similarity certainly suggest they were part of the same cultural phenomenon, created by the same population or closely related groups, sharing the same knowledge base and religious or ceremonial traditions. Poverty Point in Louisiana dated to approximately 3,700 years ago, and therefore much more recent than Göbekli Tepe, but still impressively ancient for the Americas, demonstrates the same pattern of sophisticated earthwork construction, appearing suddenly in the archaeological record without clear precedents, as if the knowledge required to design and build these massive geometric enclosures had come from somewhere else, rather than developing gradually through local experimentation. Nabta Playa in the Sahara Desert, with its stone circle that predates Stonehenge and appears to have been constructed by nomadic pastoralists who left little other evidence of sophisticated cultural development, presents yet another case of monumental architecture appearing in contexts where conventional theory suggests it shouldn't exist, raising the same uncomfortable questions about where this knowledge came from and why it manifests in widely separated locations during similar time periods. The global pattern of myths and legends about lost civilizations, about golden ages that ended in catastrophic floods and fires, about wise ancestors who possessed knowledge that later generations could only dimly remember and struggle to reconstruct, takes on new significance when we consider the possibility that these stories might preserve genuine historical memories rather than being purely symbolic narratives about the human condition. Because while individual details are obviously mythologized and distorted through countless retellings across thousands of years, the broad outlines remain remarkably consistent across cultures that had no contact with one another. Stories of great floods that destroyed previous worlds, of fires falling from the sky, of sudden climate changes that made the land uninhabitable, of survivors who fled to mountains or highlands and tried to preserve what they could of the old knowledge. The Sumerian king list, which describes impossibly long reigns for antediluvian kings before the flood, and then more reasonable reigns for post-flood rulers, might be preserving a genuine distinction between legendary pre-catastrophe history and more reliable post-catastrophe records, even if the specific chronology has been garbled beyond recovery, and the biblical flood narrative, which shares so many elements with earlier Mesopotamian flood myths, might ultimately derive from oral traditions that preserved memories of the catastrophic sea level rise and climate disruptions that accompanied the end of the last ice age. The Plato's account of Atlantis, typically dismissed as pure fiction or philosophical allegory, describes a sophisticated maritime civilization that was destroyed by earthquakes and floods approximately 9,000 years before his time, which would place this catastrophe around 9600 BCE, exactly coinciding with the period when Göbekli Tepe was being constructed, and when sea levels were rising most rapidly as the Ice Age ended. And while the specific details of Plato's account are clearly embellished or invented, the temporal coincidence is striking enough to at least raise the question of whether his story might preserve some distorted memory of real events. The implications of accepting that Göbekli Tepe might have been built by survivors of a lost civilization, rather than by the first stirrings of civilization emerging from hunter-gatherer societies, are profound and unsettling, because this interpretation requires us to abandon the comforting narrative of steady human progress and instead confront the possibility that our species has risen to sophisticated levels of cultural and technological development multiple times throughout our long history, only to collapse catastrophically and lose most of what had been achieved, forcing subsequent generations to essentially start over from much more primitive conditions. This cyclical model of history, where civilizations rise and fall and are forgotten and must be rebuilt from fragments and fading memories, appears again and again in ancient philosophical and religious traditions from around the world. From the Hindu concept of yugas, or vast cycles of time, during which civilizations rise to great heights and then collapse into darkness before beginning the cycle again, to the Greek idea of successive ages of humanity separated by catastrophic destructions, to the Norse myth of Ragnarok and the rebirth of the world, to the Mayan long count calendar that tracks vast cycles of creation and destruction, spanning thousands of years. Modern civilization, with its faith in perpetual progress and technological salvation, tends to dismiss these cyclical models as primitive or pessimistic, preferring to believe that we have finally escaped the cycle through our superior knowledge and capabilities. But Göbekli Tepe whispers a different message, suggesting that previous generations might have thought the same thing, might have believed they had achieved a level of sophistication that would endure forever, only to discover that civilizations are fragile things, vulnerable to catastrophes beyond their control or even their comprehension. And that knowledge, once lost, can be extraordinarily difficult to recover. The archaeological evidence for dramatic population declines and cultural disruptions during the Younger Dryas period, visible in sites across the Northern Hemisphere where sophisticated tool traditions suddenly disappear or degrade, where settlements are abandoned, where the material culture becomes noticeably less complex for a period of several centuries before gradually recovering, supports the hypothesis that something catastrophic happened during this period, something that disrupted human societies across vast regions and forced populations to revert to more basic survival strategies, abandoning or forgetting more sophisticated practices that had developed during earlier periods of stability. The fact that agriculture emerges relatively rapidly in multiple regions around the world during the few thousand years following the end of the Younger Dryas, appearing in the Fertile Crescent and in China, and in Mesoamerica and in several other regions, in what seems like a remarkably compressed time frame compared to the hundreds of thousands of years during which humans lived as hunter-gatherers without developing agriculture, might not indicate independent invention in each region, but rather the rediscovery or remembering of practices that had been known before and lost during the catastrophic climate disruptions. Preserved perhaps in oral traditions or in the practices of isolated populations who managed to maintain continuity through the crisis, and who then spread their knowledge to other groups as conditions stabilized and populations began to recover and expand. The question of who the builders of Göbekli Tepe actually were, whether they were the last representatives of a sophisticated pre-Younger Dryas civilization trying to preserve something of their knowledge and culture for future generations, or whether they were indeed the first stirrings of the civilization that would eventually develop into the agricultural societies of the Neolithic period, cannot be definitively answered with the evidence currently available. But the mere fact that this question can be seriously asked, that the evidence from Göbekli Tepe is compatible with either interpretation, and perhaps even more compatible with the lost civilization hypothesis than with the conventional model, should humble us and remind us that our understanding of human prehistory remains fragmentary and provisional, and subject to radical revision, as new evidence emerges from excavations or from the ocean floor, or from regions that have not yet been thoroughly investigated by archaeologists. What we can say with certainty is that the people who built Göbekli Tepe possessed knowledge and organizational capabilities far beyond what we previously attributed to humans living in that time period, that they undertook a construction project of staggering ambition and sophistication for reasons we can only guess at, and that they chose to bury their achievement rather than leave it exposed to the elements or to the potential depredations of later peoples, suggesting a level of foresight and intentionality that points toward a deeper understanding of time and impermanence and the fragility of human cultural achievements than we typically associate with supposedly primitive hunter-gatherers standing at the dawn of civilization. The surfaces of those massive T-shaped pillars at Göbekli Tepe are not blank monoliths standing mute and inscrutable against the passage of millennia, but rather they speak to us across the vast gulf of time through an intricate vocabulary of carved images and symbols that cover the stone like the pages of a book, written in a language we can, almost, but not quite read, tantalizing in their seeming clarity and maddening in their ultimate inscrutability. Because while we can identify the individual elements with reasonable confidence, here a scorpion, there a snake, a fox rendered in profile with careful attention to anatomical detail, a vulture spreading its wings across the stone surface, a lion crouched in a posture that suggests both power and vigilance. We cannot with any certainty decode what these images meant to the people who carved them, what stories they were telling, what knowledge they were attempting to preserve, what warnings or instructions or histories they were encoding in stone for reasons that seemed sufficiently important to justify the enormous labor required to execute these carvings with nothing more sophisticated than stone tools and obsidian blades, and an apparently infinite capacity for patient, meticulous work. The animals depicted on these pillars represent a carefully curated selection from the fauna available in the region during the early Holocene, not a comprehensive catalogue of everything the builders encountered in their environment, but rather a specific subset chosen according to criteria that remain frustratingly opaque to modern interpreters. Though various researchers have proposed that the selection might be based on astronomical symbolism, with certain animals representing constellations visible in the night sky above Anatolia 12,000 years ago. Or alternatively, that the animals might represent totemic symbols associated with different clans or groups who participated in the construction and use of the site. Or perhaps that they encode information about seasonal cycles and the movements of game animals, and the proper times for various activities. Or conceivably, all of these interpretations might be partially correct, with the imagery operating on multiple symbolic levels, simultaneously in the way that sophisticated religious and astronomical systems often do, layering meaning upon meaning, until the full significance becomes accessible only to initiates who had been trained in the proper interpretation. The scorpions that appear repeatedly throughout the complex, rendered with an attention to detail that captures the segmented tail and the distinctive pincers and the overall form with remarkable accuracy, have puzzled researchers because scorpions are not particularly prominent in the ecology of the region and would not seem to be obvious candidates for the kind of symbolic importance suggested by their frequent appearance in the carvings. Unless the significance is not ecological, but astronomical, as some researchers have proposed based on the observation that the constellation we now call Scorpius occupied a particularly important position in the sky during the epoch when Göbekli Tepe was constructed, marking certain celestial events or seasonal transitions that might have had profound religious or practical significance for people whose lives were intimately connected to the cycles of nature in ways that modern urban populations can barely comprehend. The snakes, which undulate across the stone surfaces in sinuous curves that demonstrate the carver's keen observation of these reptiles' distinctive movement patterns, appear in mythological and religious contexts across virtually every human culture that has left records, typically associated with transformation and renewal because of their ability to shed their skins, with wisdom and secret knowledge because of their enigmatic nature and their association with the earth, and with hidden places, and with danger and death because of the venomous species that pose genuine threats to human life. And the prominence of snake imagery at Göbekli Tepe suggests that whatever symbolic framework the builders were working within, it shared certain fundamental associations with the serpent symbolism that would later appear in cultures ranging from ancient Egypt to Mesoamerica to the biblical tradition, raising the intriguing possibility that these associations are not cultural inventions, but rather represent something more fundamental about how human consciousness relates to these creatures. The vultures carved into the pillars with their wings, spread wide in postures that might represent flight or might represent the threat. Displays these birds use to intimidate rivals or predators have attracted particular attention from researchers because of their potential astronomical significance. Most notably, the pillar known as the vulture stone, which appears to depict a group of animals arranged in positions that closely match the positions of several prominent constellations, as they would have appeared in the sky around 10,950 BCE, with the vulture itself possibly representing what we now call Sagittarius, and the other animals corresponding to other recognizable star patterns, creating what might be the oldest known star map carved in permanent form, a record of the heavens as they appeared during what researchers have identified as potentially corresponding to the date of the Younger Dryas impact event that triggered catastrophic climate changes across the Northern Hemisphere. If this interpretation is correct, if the vulture stone really does preserve a record of the sky on a specific date associated with a cosmic catastrophe, then we are looking at something far more profound than mere artistic decoration or religious symbolism. We are looking at a deliberate attempt to record and preserve knowledge about an event that must have seemed apocalyptic to those who experienced it. An event important enough that survivors wanted to ensure that future generations would know when it happened, and perhaps what celestial configuration preceded or accompanied it, creating a warning or a memorial carved in the most permanent medium available to people without metal or writing, trusting that stone would endure long enough to carry their message forward, across thousands of years, to whoever might eventually find it and possess the knowledge necessary to decode its meaning. Among the most enigmatic symbols carved into the pillars is what researchers have termed the handbag symbol, a simple geometric form that resembles a modern handbag or bucket, and that appears not only at Göbekli Tepe, but also in ancient Sumerian art, separated by several thousand years, in Olmec carvings in Mexico, separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years, and in Aboriginal Australian rock art, separated from the Anatolian examples by virtually the entire span of the globe, and by chronological gaps that make any conventional explanation of cultural transmission seem impossible. Yet, there it is, the same distinctive symbol appearing again and again across vast distances of space and time, either representing one of the most remarkable examples of convergent symbolism in human history, where completely separate cultures independently arrived at the same visual representation for whatever concept or object this symbol encoded, or alternatively suggesting something far more unsettling, that these widely separated cultures shared a common source, a common origin point that predates all of them, and from which this symbol was inherited or copied or remembered, passed down through oral traditions or carried by migrating populations, or preserved in the fragmentary knowledge of survivors from some earlier cultural horizon that has left no other trace in the archaeological record, except for these scattered instances of identical symbolism appearing in contexts where they shouldn't exist, according to our current models of how human cultures develop and spread and interact with one another across time and space. The fox appears with striking frequency throughout the carvings at Göbekli Tepe, rendered with the same careful attention to anatomical accuracy and behavioral detail that characterizes all the animal imagery at the site. And while modern interpreters can observe that the fox is depicted and can describe its posture and proportions and the skill with which it was carved, we remain fundamentally uncertain about what the fox meant to these ancient builders. Why they chose to immortalize this particular animal in stone with such evident care and repetition, whether it represented a constellation or a clan totem or a mythological figure or some concept that we lack the cultural context to even imagine. Because the symbolic vocabularies of ancient peoples were embedded in entire systems of meaning and association that were transmitted orally and ritually, and that have been completely lost when those cultures disappeared, leaving us with only the visual fragments preserved in carvings and paintings and artifacts. Images we can see but cannot truly read, because we lack the cultural dictionary that would allow us to translate these symbols back into the concepts and stories and beliefs they originally encoded. The repetition of the fox across multiple pillars and multiple enclosures suggests that whatever it represented was centrally important to the religious or symbolic framework that governed the construction and use of Göbekli Tepe. Not a casual decorative element, but rather a core component of the message or knowledge or worship that this entire complex was designed to facilitate or preserve. And the fact that we cannot determine with any confidence what that significance was serves as a humbling reminder of how much has been lost. How many entire systems of meaning and knowledge have vanished so completely that we can barely even formulate the right questions to ask about the fragmentary evidence that survives. The human figures that appear occasionally among the animal imagery are disturbing in their incompleteness. Frequently depicted without heads, their bodies rendered with less naturalistic detail than the animals, sometimes appearing to be schematic representations rather than attempts at realistic portrayal, and the modified human skulls that have been found at the site, carved and shaped in ways that suggest they were objects of ritual significance, rather than simply the remains of the dead being disposed of through conventional burial practices, point towards some kind of skull cult or ancestor worship or belief system that placed particular emphasis on the head as the seat of identity or power or connection to the divine or the dead. The headless human figures might represent the dead themselves, depicted without heads because the heads had been removed for ritual purposes, and perhaps preserved separately or displayed in ways that have left no archaeological trace. Or they might represent some mythological or religious concept about the relationship between body and soul, or life and death, or the transformation that occurs when a person dies and becomes something other than what they were in life. And the fact that we can generate multiple plausible interpretations but cannot definitively choose between them illustrates the fundamental challenge of interpreting symbolic systems from cultures that left no written records and no clear cultural descendants who might preserve the oral traditions that would explain what these images meant. The overall impression created by standing among these carved pillars, by walking through the circular enclosures where these symbols surround you on all sides, by contemplating the sheer density of meaning that must have been embedded in these images, for people who understood the full symbolic vocabulary, is one of being in the presence of a complex and sophisticated communication that we can perceive but not fully comprehend. Like listening to someone speak in a language that shares enough cognates with the languages you know that you can catch occasional words and phrases, but not enough to follow the overall meaning or narrative arc of what is being said. The builders of Göbekli Tepe were clearly attempting to communicate something they considered profoundly important enough to justify the enormous investment of labor and skill required to carve these images into hard limestone, using only stone tools, important enough to preserve in the most permanent medium available to them. And the fact that they chose to bury the entire complex rather than leave it exposed suggests they understood that the passage of time might make direct cultural transmission impossible, but hoped that the physical evidence would survive to be discovered by future generations, who might possess different knowledge or perspectives or analytical tools that would allow them to decode the message that the original builders were trying to send forward through time. The possibility that these symbols constitute a deliberate message across millennia, a time capsule designed to preserve knowledge that the builders feared would be lost during whatever catastrophe or cultural collapse they anticipated or had already experienced, reframes our entire approach to interpreting the imagery. Because if we assume that the primary purpose was communication with the distant future, rather than serving the immediate religious or ceremonial needs of the contemporary population, then we should be looking for encoded information rather than symbolic representations, for attempts to convey practical knowledge about astronomy or climate or catastrophic events, rather than mythological narratives or religious iconography. Though, of course, these categories are not mutually exclusive, and the imagery might serve multiple purposes simultaneously, operating as religious symbolism for the immediate community while also encoding astronomical observations or historical records intended for whoever might eventually excavate the site. The challenge is that without a key, without some kind of Rosetta Stone that provides parallel texts in known and unknown symbolic languages, we are left to guess at meanings based on analogies to later cultures and on our own modern assumptions about what kinds of information people might want to preserve. Assumptions that might be completely wrong because they're based on our contemporary values and priorities, rather than on the actual concerns and worldview of people living through the catastrophic end of the last ice age. People who might have had entirely different ideas about what knowledge was worth preserving and how it should be encoded, and what future generations would need to know to avoid the mistakes or misfortunes that had befallen their own civilization. The stark reality that confronts anyone who seriously engages with the symbolic vocabulary preserved at Göbekli Tepe is that we are dealing with a sophisticated system of meaning and communication created by people who are clearly intelligent and capable and culturally complex. People who possessed knowledge about astronomy and architecture and organization and artistic traditions that took generations to develop, and yet we cannot read what they wrote, cannot understand what they were trying to tell us, cannot access the meanings that were embedded in these carvings with such evident care and intentionality, because the cultural context that would make these symbols legible has been lost so completely that we can barely even reconstruct what questions we should be asking, let alone arrive at definitive answers. And this failure of comprehension across the millennia serves as a powerful reminder that human knowledge is far more fragile than we typically acknowledge, that entire systems of understanding can vanish so thoroughly that later generations are left staring at the evidence of their existence without any way to recover what was lost, which raises the uncomfortable question of what future archaeologists might make of our own civilization. If some catastrophe were to erase the cultural continuity that allows knowledge to be transmitted from one generation to the next, leaving only fragmentary physical evidence whose original meaning and purpose had become completely opaque to whoever eventually discovered the ruins of our cities and attempted to reconstruct what we believed and knew and considered important enough to preserve. The acceptance of Göbekli Tepe as genuine, as a 12,000-year-old architectural marvel that fundamentally contradicts our comfortable narratives about the linear progression of human civilization from primitive to sophisticated, from ignorant to enlightened, from powerless to dominant, carries implications that extend far beyond the merely academic disputes about dating techniques and cultural interpretations that occupy professional archaeologists in their journals and conferences. Because what this enigmatic site ultimately forces us to confront is the deeply unsettling possibility that we might not actually know our own history, that there might be entire chapters of human achievement and catastrophe and knowledge that have been erased so thoroughly by time and disaster, and the simple passage of generations that we have no memory they ever existed. No record of their accomplishments, no awareness that our ancestors might have risen to heights of sophistication and cultural complexity, only to collapse catastrophically and lose everything they had built, leaving their descendants to start over from fragments and fading memories while the physical evidence of previous achievements crumbled into dust or sank beneath rising seas, or was ground to powder by advancing glaciers that cared nothing for the preservation of human cultural achievements. The standard model of human prehistory that we absorbed through years of education, the narrative arc that carries our species from African origins through gradual dispersal across the globe, through the long Paleolithic period of hunting and gathering and slow cultural evolution, then accelerating through the Neolithic revolution of agriculture and settled communities, and finally exploding into the historical period with its cities and empires and written records and technological innovations, presents itself as comprehensive and well-established and thoroughly supported by archaeological evidence. And yet Göbekli Tepe stands as a massive anomaly that this model cannot adequately explain, a data point so profoundly inconsistent with our theoretical framework that it should prompt us to question whether the framework itself might be fundamentally flawed, built upon incomplete evidence and unexamined assumptions about what ancient peoples were capable of achieving and what kinds of knowledge might have been lost during the catastrophic climate transitions that marked the end of the Pleistocene epoch. The question of what we lose when civilizations collapse and knowledge is forgotten becomes more than merely academic, when we consider that our own civilization, despite all its technological sophistication and its apparent mastery over nature and its confident assumption of permanence, might be far more fragile than we care to acknowledge, because while we have certainly achieved things that would seem miraculous to our ancestors from even a few centuries ago, while we have accumulated vast libraries of information and developed technologies that allow us to manipulate matter and energy in ways that previous generations could not have imagined, the preservation of all this knowledge depends upon maintaining an extraordinarily complex infrastructure of institutions and technologies and cultural practices that could potentially be disrupted by catastrophes, ranging from nuclear war to climate change, to pandemic disease, to economic collapse, to any number of other potential disasters that futurists and risk analysts regularly catalogue in their attempts to assess existential threats to human civilization. Our books and digital records and carefully preserved artifacts would mean nothing if the cultural continuity required to interpret and use them were broken, if the chain of transmission from one generation to the next were severed by some catastrophe that killed enough people or disrupted society thoroughly enough that the survivors were forced to focus entirely on immediate survival, rather than on preserving the accumulated knowledge of previous generations. And in such a scenario, future archaeologists excavating the ruins of our cities might find themselves in a position strikingly similar to our own relationship with Göbekli Tepe, staring at evidence of sophisticated achievements they could describe but not fully understand, contemplating artifacts and structures whose original purpose and meaning had become completely opaque because the cultural context that would make them intelligible had been irretrievably lost. The humbling realization that begins to dawn when we truly contemplate the implications of Göbekli Tepe is that our civilization, for all its remarkable achievements and confident self-assessment as the pinnacle of human cultural evolution, might not actually represent the first time that human beings have organized themselves into complex societies capable of sophisticated engineering and astronomical observation and artistic traditions and monumental construction, but rather might be merely the latest iteration in a much longer and more cyclical history of civilizational rise and fall. A history in which previous peaks of human achievement have been followed by catastrophic collapses so complete that subsequent generations had no memory of what came before, no awareness that their supposedly primitive ancestors had once possessed knowledge and capabilities that would not be matched again for thousands of years, if ever, because different civilizations developed different strengths and weaknesses, different technological paths and cultural priorities, and there is no guarantee that a civilization that rebuilds after collapse will eventually recover all the knowledge that was lost or will develop in the same directions as its predecessors. The ancient Romans achieved remarkable feats of engineering and architecture and urban planning, developing concrete formulations and construction techniques and infrastructural systems that would not be matched in Europe for over 1,000 years after their civilization collapsed. And the fall of Rome meant not just political fragmentation and economic disruption, but also the loss of vast amounts of practical knowledge and technical skill that had to be slowly and painfully rediscovered during the medieval and Renaissance periods. And this relatively recent and well-documented example of knowledge loss following civilizational collapse occurred despite the preservation of written records and the continuity of religious institutions, and the relatively modest scale of the disruption compared to what might have occurred during the catastrophic climate changes of the Younger Dryas period, suggesting that far more complete erasures of human cultural achievements are not only possible, but perhaps even inevitable given sufficient time and sufficient disruption. The alternative explanation that mainstream archaeology offers for Göbekli Tepe, the interpretation that insists these structures were indeed built by hunter-gatherers, but that we have simply underestimated what such societies were capable of achieving when sufficiently motivated by religious devotion, or social competition, or whatever psychological and cultural factors drove them to undertake such an ambitious construction project, deserves serious consideration because it has the virtue of not requiring any radical departures from established models of human cultural evolution, not demanding that we posit lost civilizations or catastrophic knowledge erasures, or any of the more speculative scenarios that more adventurous interpreters have proposed. And there is certainly something to be said for the principle of parsimony. That suggests we should prefer explanations that require the fewest additional assumptions beyond what we already know to be true about human capabilities and motivations. If we accept this conventional interpretation, if we agree that Göbekli Tepe represents the beginning rather than the end of something, the first stirrings of organizational complexity and monumental architecture emerging from hunter-gatherer societies rather than the final monuments of a collapsing civilization, then we are still forced to completely rewrite our understanding of what the transition from Paleolithic to Neolithic societies actually looked like. To acknowledge that the neat progression from hunting to farming, to settled communities to monumental construction was never as linear or inevitable as our textbooks suggested. To recognize that human cultural evolution is far more complex and unpredictable and capable of surprising us with anomalies and exceptions and entirely unexpected achievements than the simplified models we use for teaching and popular communication can adequately capture. The relevance of these questions about ancient history and lost civilizations and the fragility of human cultural achievements extends far beyond academic debates and historical curiosity. Because the way we understand our past fundamentally shapes how we think about our present and our future. And if we believe that civilization is a recent and singular achievement, representing humanity's first and only ascent from primitive origins towards sophisticated culture and technology, then we are likely to assume a kind of permanence and inevitability to our current trajectory that might be entirely unwarranted, might blind us to the genuine fragility of the systems we depend upon, and the very real possibility that catastrophic disruptions could send us spiraling backward toward conditions that our comfortable modern existence has allowed us to forget were the normal state of human existence for most of our species' history. Every civilization in history has believed itself to be the pinnacle of human achievement, the culmination of progress, the endpoint toward which all previous generations were stumbling in their ignorance and primitiveness. And yet every civilization that has made this assumption has eventually discovered, often catastrophically, that they were merely one chapter in a much longer story. One iteration in a continuing cycle of rise and fall that appears to be intrinsic to the human condition, rather than something we have finally transcended through our superior knowledge and technology. And the archaeological record is littered with the ruins of societies that thought they had achieved permanence only to collapse into fragments that later generations would excavate with a mixture of admiration for what was achieved and puzzlement about how it was lost. The specific question of whether Göbekli Tepe was built by the last survivors of a sophisticated pre-Younger Dryas civilization or by the first stirrings of the Neolithic Revolution emerging from hunter-gatherer roots may never be definitively answered, because the kind of evidence that would conclusively settle the matter, extensive written records, clear stratigraphic sequences showing technological development over time, undisturbed coastal settlements from the late Pleistocene period, simply does not exist and may never be recovered from the portions of the archaeological record that have been destroyed by rising seas or glacial activity, or the simple erosion of 12,000 years of weathering and decay. But the mere fact that we can seriously ask this question, that the evidence from Göbekli Tepe is ambiguous enough to support multiple interpretations, including the possibility of a lost civilization, should serve as a powerful corrective to the excessive confidence with which we sometimes make pronouncements about what ancient peoples could or could not have achieved, about what human societies were like during periods for which we have only fragmentary evidence, about the inevitability and linearity of the progress narrative that dominates our contemporary understanding of history, the intellectual humility that Göbekli Tepe demands of us, the acknowledgement that there is much we do not know and perhaps cannot know about our own deep history, represents a healthy correction to the hubris that often characterizes modern civilization's relationship with the past. The tendency to assume that because we have more technology and more accumulated scientific knowledge than previous generations, we therefore understand everything worth understanding about how we got here and what paths our ancestors followed and what alternatives might have existed, but were lost along the way. The open question that Göbekli Tepe poses to everyone who contemplates its weathered stones and enigmatic carvings, the mystery that remains unresolved despite decades of excavation and analysis and theorizing, concerns not just the specific identity of the builders or their precise motivations or the exact meaning of the symbols they left behind, but rather cuts to something more fundamental about how we understand ourselves as a species and what stories we tell about our journey through time and what assumptions we make about progress and permanence and the relationship between past and future. We still do not know who built Göbekli Tepe in any definitive sense, cannot say with certainty whether they were primitive hunter-gatherers achieving something far beyond what we thought such societies capable of, or whether they were sophisticated survivors of an older civilization, preserving what knowledge they could before it was lost entirely. Cannot decode the full meaning of the astronomical alignments and animal carvings and deliberate burial that make this site so profoundly mysterious. And this gap in our knowledge, this fundamental uncertainty about something so important to understanding our own history, might actually be the most important lesson that Göbekli Tepe has to teach us. The recognition that there are limits to what we can know about the past, that entire civilizations might have risen and fallen, leaving only fragmentary traces that we cannot fully interpret, that human cultural achievements are far more ephemeral and fragile than we typically acknowledge, and that the confident narratives we construct about historical progress and human development might be built upon foundations far less solid than we imagine, represents a kind of wisdom that contemporary civilization desperately needs as it confronts its own uncertain future, and contemplates the very real possibility that our own achievements might someday be as mysterious and misunderstood to future archaeologists as Göbekli Tepe is to us today. The simple fact of Göbekli Tepe's existence, standing on that wind-swept Anatolian hillside after 12,000 years of burial and preservation, serves as a permanent reminder that we do not know everything we think we know, that history is longer and stranger and more complex than the simplified narratives we tell in textbooks and popular media, that human beings have always been more capable and more sophisticated and more resilient than we give them credit for, capable of achieving remarkable things under the most unlikely circumstances and equally capable of losing everything they had built when catastrophe struck, or when the particular combination of circumstances that allowed their civilization to flourish shifted in ways they could not control or predict. Standing among those ancient pillars today, under the protective structures that now shield them from further weathering while allowing visitors to approach and contemplate their enigmatic presence, you are confronting not just an archaeological puzzle or a historical curiosity, but rather a mirror that reflects uncomfortable truths about human civilizations and their fragility, about knowledge and its impermanence, about the hubris of assuming that we are the first or the smartest or the most advanced humans who have ever lived, when the evidence carved in stone suggests that maybe, just maybe, we are simply the latest in a long line of human societies that looked up at the stars and wondered about their place in the cosmos, and tried to preserve something meaningful for whoever would come after them, never knowing whether that future audience would possess the knowledge necessary to understand the message, or would stare in baffled incomprehension at symbols whose meanings had been lost to time, leaving only the mute testimony of the stones themselves and the profound and humbling mystery of who built them and why.